So an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences has reignited the lab leak debate. So Jeffrey Sachs, who was the chair of a commission at Columbia University tasked with investigating the origins of the pandemic, has this new article. My colleague Sharon Lerner over at The Intercept has a good piece on it yesterday that I would encourage everybody to read. But she writes that writing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Sachs and his co-author, Neil Harrison, said that federal agencies and universities possess evidence that has not been adequately reviewed, including virus databases, biological samples, viral sequences, email communications, and laboratory notebooks. Sachs and Harrison also highlighted a tantalizing scientific detail that may be an indication that SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus that causes COVID-19, originated in a laboratory, a sequence of 8 amino acids on a critical part of the virus's spike protein that is identical to an amino acid sequence found in cells that line human airwaves. And so, Emily, Sharon interviewed a number of different virologists for this article that follows Jeffrey Sachs's piece, and asked, could this be a coincidence? This precise match between these amino acid proteins. And the answers that she got were basically like, I suppose it's theoretically possible that it could be a coincidence, but the number of coincidences that are starting to have to stack up for all of these things to have to be coincidences is getting very hard to believe. So what's your read on this latest from Sachs in this? This was not a peer-reviewed article. This was in the opinion section, but the fact that it's now in these major kind of flagship scientific magazines is, I think, suggesting that even the scientific community at the very top is saying, no, this is a very live debate.
Right, and Sharon, I think, got a preview of what the peer review process might produce by doing journalism and asking virologists.
Reviewing it with peers.
Right. Yes. She consulted the peers, and it's to your point about coincidences that would have to stack up. Well, the other major coincidence. So we're talking about coincidences in the amino acid spike protein. We're also talking about coincidences in the fact that this virus emerges exactly where a lab is doing this kind of research. So that's two right there that we're getting into like incredible, unprecedented coincidence territory. But also, when Sachs says not adequately reviewed, that's an incredible statement. To me, those two words are huge because it's this adequately reviewed question. They still haven't been adequately reviewed. We're more than 2 years into this. Could they have been? Could this evidence have emerged and have been more adequately reviewed 2 years ago? I think the answer to that is unquestionably yes. Our policy, the world's policy, it's not just the United States policy, but the world's policy towards China, I think should have been very different with this information a long time ago. And yet here we are 2+ years that, that foreign policy position has still yet to shift to really say, like, the evidence is very serious that this came from the lab. And I think things would have been very, very different for the better towards a more just sort of global positioning if this was not such an untouchable question in the media and in the scientific community for a long time. If you look back at that email Francis Collins sent Fauci saying, is there anything we can do to push back on this? It's incredible. It makes it look so just so repulsive.
Yeah, and Fauci writes back, "Don't worry, this is just a shiny object. It'll go away." And Sachs has been a really impressive figure in this journey. He was named to chair this commission of there are 12 of the kind of leading virologists, and deep into the process, he discovered that I think 5 of them had these intense conflicts of interest related to this particular lab and this particular research, and he just stepped back and said, "This is not how this is done." And disbanded and blew the whistle on the conflicted kind of investigation into this, and now has put forward this paper, which draws on a lot of research and work that's been done by other scientists before him, and he very much zeroes in on this DARPA grant proposal that was jointly, as you mentioned, it was jointly produced by Ralph Barrick, the researcher in UNC, who's kind of a one of the foremost kind of gain of function researchers in the world, and the Wuhan lab. And the big question has always been, was any of the research described in this grant proposal done before or after the grant proposal? Because we know that DARPA, in the end, rejected the grant proposal. And so EcoHealth Alliance, which made this proposal, has said, well, we didn't actually get the money. And so, yes, it looks like we have a recipe here for the pandemic, that precisely matches it. But we didn't actually do that work because we didn't get funded for it. Sharon and others have interviewed a lot of scientists who say, well, it's pretty standard fare that you would do some of this work ahead of time. And so Sachs is pointing to this and saying, not only is it standard fare that you would do some of this work ahead of time, but here is precisely why you would do that work and how it would match up and how that work could then have led to an accident that ended up producing the pandemic. And what we also have to know is that there's outside funding for this lab. It's not just the NIH, it's not just EcoHealth Alliance that is funding this lab in Wuhan. We do know, according to the State Department, that there's a collaboration with the People's Liberation Army there. We don't know how much funding the PLA gives to this lab, but we know that if they wanted to do research, they're not just sitting around in Wuhan waiting for NIH funding. So we know that they had the recipe, we know, because it shows up in this DARPA grant. And then the question is, did they do some of that work? Sachs is saying it looks like they did.
Right. And that's a huge element here because, again, I was talking earlier about the culpability of China, but there also clearly is a potential that there's culpability on the behalf of the United States that was funding and not with adequate oversight this research. And that's a huge, huge question, too, that we absolutely are behind on answering because, and we've talked about this before, Ryan, at any given moment, this can happen again. Right? Like, if we don't know what's happening, at any given moment, this can emerge from some laboratory in some corner of the world that's getting United States funding and is not adequately providing oversight. And who knows? But this is why what Sachs is saying is so important, and it should have happened years ago.
Right, and that's a key point. We are still funding this type of research, like as we speak, and so there are huge questions about whether this research should be conducted at all. But then, if you're going to say, okay, well, we're going to continue to fund this research, the questions are, under what conditions and where are you going to do it? There's a lab in Colorado that does some extremely dangerous research. I'd rather they not do it at all, but they're doing it somewhere way out in the mountains, so that if they do have an accident, they can isolate it ahead of time. That's the theory, at least. I still think it's too dangerous, but at least that's a theory. And they take all of the most sophisticated protections that they can, or they claim they do. But the Wuhan lab didn't even claim to do that. The Wuhan lab is a lower level lab. It's the kind of place where people are, they're supposed to be wearing masks, but they're not always wearing masks. And if you look at pictures of it, it basically looks like it's in a strip mall, and it's in a city of some 20 plus million people. And so if it gets out, it's not as if you then have a chance. Okay, let's track everybody and make sure that nobody leaves this like remote mountainous area. It's like, oh no, they're already down grocery shopping at the seafood market. So it's too late for that. So these are the questions that we should be asking, because we don't want 10 years from now to be looking back at COVID as like the gentle pandemic. Like, wasn't that nice that there was only a 0.5% case fatality rate with that, and it didn't affect children.
Right, and that strikes me as a really important point, because every time that we don't have something like this emerging while we're doing this research is a blessing. Like, we are lucky every time that this doesn't happen, because we know that there isn't adequate oversight, and we know that because of exactly the emerging evidence that we keep seeing, which even at best, we have learned that this research was being done in that lab without the adequate security measures. So whether or not it was COVID, we know that what was happening in that lab was not up to standards. And so we're not entitled to pandemic-free years. We're not entitled, when we're at this high level of technological and medical experimentation that we do everywhere in so many different ways, we are not entitled to any year without a pandemic. It is a very fine line between safety and a lack of safety. And these questions should have been answered immediately, but they should be answered immediately now. But there's so many powerful people with reputations at stake that will continue trying to obscure the truth. And I don't know that it'll ever be accepted.
Right, no. Anyway, we'll have more Rising right after this.